All right. Good afternoon, Austin. Good afternoon, South by Southwest. I'm Daniel Motidlover. I'm the CEO of Embraer X, the market incubator and accelerator of Embraer, the aircraft manufacturer. I'm also the head of Global Innovation Ecosystems, which is all about the connections and the collaboration and partnerships we have the opportunity to go about in a huge event like this one. This is the same event where we had a couple of days ago my personal hero, Daisy Ridley, who plays Rey in Star Wars on stage. Now I get to be on stage in South by Southwest as well. It's pretty unbelievable, right? And I'm so honored to invite our panelists for the great discussion we're going to have now this afternoon. And I'll start inviting Rose Cox-Galhotra with Breakthrough Energies to join our panel. Please, Rose. So great to have you. And now I also want to invite our second panelist, Lucas Kussner with Sustainable Aero Labs. Thank you, Lucas. Great to have you. All right. So for us to get started, I want to mention we're going to be talking about probably the biggest challenge in the history of our industry of aviation, of air mobility. It's a challenge that we need to face, and the objective of this panel is to really go about some of the, we could call not so comfortable truths, but that's what this panel is going to be about. We also had a couple of days ago the great Brené Brown speaking here at South by Southwest, the one who had this amazing TED Talk on vulnerability. So this, as an industry, is our moment of vulnerability. We are opening up, and we want to discuss what is still blocking us from making the transition happen, from really getting to where we need to be in terms of the strong commitments that, as an industry, we all made. Aircraft manufacturers, airlines, our suppliers, everybody, we need to get to carbon neutral in 2050. On this panel, we'll have the opportunities to discuss about this challenge and about the measures that are ongoing or maybe not happening at the pace that we need, and hopefully bring some insights and some new ideas that can really help us to collaborate towards this ambitious but extremely needed goal. And to get us started, I'll just ask Rose to introduce herself and talk a bit about Breakthrough Energies and the work that they have been doing. Please, Rose.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the invitation to speak here. Daniel, this is wonderful. Thank you all for coming. It's a very important topic, so glad to see some faces here. To start, let me give you a little bit of background on myself. So I'm a chemical engineer by training. I have a PhD in chemical engineering. I have focused for the last many years of my career on early stage technologies. And right now, my role at Breakthrough Energy is to help mature very early stage technologies. And I do that by supporting our Fellows program, which I'll talk about a little bit more. But suffice it to say that my role involves helping to helping the team that selects and finds these really early stage technologies that could have a big impact. And then I work with the teams once we've selected them to help figure out what they're going to do, right? So great, we're going to give you some funding. What are you going to do with it that's going to help you move on to the next phase of development? And so we negotiate measurable, actionable, technical milestones, but also keep an eye on commercial readiness, because that's important. And then during the fellowship, I work with the teams very closely to kind of help make sure that they're making progress, help with the issues, the challenges that come up, because this stuff isn't easy, let's face it, right? So that's me in a nutshell, right? But let me talk about Breakthrough Energy real quick, just to kind of frame the discussion. Sure. So Breakthrough Energy is a network of individuals throughout the globe who are all focused on accelerating the world's transition, its journey to a clean energy future. That's it at a very high level. But some of you may have heard of our venture capital arm, Breakthrough Energy Ventures, which was founded in 2015 by Bill Gates. In the 9 years that have followed that establishment, the organization has grown and sort of morphed a bit over time, right? So now we are able to cover the entire technology development pipeline from discovery to development to deployment. And then underpinning all of that, we have funding available to help support those technologies. We have work in place to support smart policies that are going to help the markets grow for those new technologies. And then also, the ability to mobilize a network of partners to really do this, because climate change is complex. No one organization can do any of this themselves, which is why it's wonderful to be speaking with you folks, right? You are a wonderful part of that partnership. So I could talk maybe quickly about the different areas that I've just mentioned, right? So discovery, that's the area that I work in, right? So the Fellows Program is focused on looking at the white space. So if we take a look at the whole technology development pipeline across all sources of emissions, so manufacturing, food and agriculture, electricity, transportation, which is why we're all here, right?
Right.
That's another big area. If we look across all of those areas, where are there gaps in our technology development pipeline? Where are there places where having some innovation in a particular area can really unlock substantial CO2 emissions reduction sort of down the road, right? And so we're looking for things that are innovative, that are, nobody's doing them. It's a breakthrough, really, so not just an incremental improvement. Those are important too, don't get me wrong, but our niche is to really look for breakthrough technologies. And then, we work with both founders in startups as well as, even reaching pre-startup back into the academic spaces. So, academic institutions, national labs, stuff that's not quite ready for a startup. And then the Fellows Program provides funding and mentorship to help really mature those technologies. So generally, the technology risk level is very high, and that's intentional. We know that not everything's going to work, and that's okay, but we've got to take some big swings to try to develop the pipeline. So that's the program in a nutshell. Then moving on to the development phase, that's where technologies that have done that initial technical de-risking then move on to scaling up and that next level of technical de-risking. And then at the same time, the companies are also growing and getting themselves set up for commercial success. And that's really our venture capital arm, where they come in to kind of support that process. And then after that, right, so your technology's ready, it's been fully de-risked, you need to deploy it, that's a whole new set of challenges. That's a whole can of worms. And so our Catalyst team, Breakthrough Energy Catalyst, helps support first-of-a-kind demonstration projects. So at that point, like I said, the technology is largely de-risked, but the risk that remains is financial. And so they are in place to help set up the financial vehicles that are necessary for those first-of-a-kind demonstration projects to succeed and have the impact that we're all looking for. And then at the same time, we've got a US policy and advocacy team, one in the EU. We also have a communications team, a partnerships team, all really helping to make sure that the markets and sort of advocacy throughout the globe is in place for those technologies to succeed once they reach maturity. So that was a lot. Thanks for hanging with me. But hopefully that gives you a sense of how Breakthrough Energy is organized.
It's really broad and impressive. Thanks so much for breaking it down for us in a very nice manner, Rose. But I like when you mention among the different industries and activities that you see, there's transportation, of course, right? And I mean, we're so proud that Embraer X was probably one of the first who brought the topic of transportation up here in South by Southwest, which is not a transportation event, is not an aviation event. It's an innovation, creativity, and it's really nice that we see it became a track, and now we are gathering more partners and more collaboration. We hope that this will foster, which is very much connected to what you do, right, Lucas?
Yes, so thank you, Daniel, for inviting me on stage. I'm Lucas. I'm one of the founders of the Sustainable Air Lab, and we are an accelerator program that supports startups worldwide, focusing on decarbonizing flight. And we were founded, or we got together in early 2021. We were basically a lockdown project when everybody was wondering still, whether this would be the death of aviation. We said no, but there will be another bigger challenge on the horizon, which at that point nobody was really looking at, and this is how can we become a sustainable industry with this hugely complex topic. And we're not a traditional accelerator program, but we focus on bringing startups together with mentors from aviation, from related industries, from venture capital, and to really focus on their objectives. What should be the next steps the company should undertake in the next months to really go ahead, step by step. We have been quite successful with this so far. We have had over 70 companies from all over the world in the program so far. We're also working together with both Embraer and Breakthrough Energy, which is great to see, and we're basically a platform where we want to bring people together who really want to create an impact, because it's difficult to create an impact in the sense that there is still a lot of greenwashing. There is really not a clear way forward that you can just go down and get to the goal. So, which makes it very important to just exchange and discuss and really keep each other updated. A little bit about myself. Without really planning for it, I kind of closed full circles with the Sustainable Air Lab. So I started out as a consultant in the media startup and the renewable energies field. That included even at some point writing on startups, especially for renewable energies for the FT. I then realized that I like airplanes very much and transferred in aviation. Spent 10 years building the strategy for Hamburg as an aerospace hub, and also running the Crystal Cabin Awards, which is kind of the Oscars of aircraft interiors. And then my calendar cleared a little more in 2020, so I got together with a friend to work on the Sustainable Air Lab, and then it turned from a side project into not a full project, but I still have another job. I'm working kind of on the hardware side with the Hamburg Center of Applied Aeronautical Research, the ZAL, which is a testing facility and innovation campus to kind of test the demonstrators that hopefully come out now in the next months and years. So very exciting, and it's a lot of synergies, a lot of interesting conversations ever since, and one of the most interesting conversations always here at South by Southwest. So
I'm glad you mentioned the Crystal Cabin Awards as, our red carpet moment of aviation, since we are South by Southwest, right? We have so many movie stars and music stars. So the talents that are hearing us, they are very welcome to join aviation. They are entitled to their own red carpet as well.
Yes, absolutely. So a little off topic here. One of the last Crystal Cabin events pre-pandemic, I did a keynote panel with the CEO of Emirates, but I also invited one of the top 10 supermodels in the world to the stage, who is also an investor in a Hamburg startup doing lighting for aircraft interiors. And this was kind of my personal highlight, because I thought, like, if 2 years before I would have told people, here we'll have this industry award ceremony, which is focusing on B2B, and I'm going to bring one of the top supermodels in the world to the stage, that they probably would have locked me up. And but I still did it, so it's true red carpet sometimes, yeah.
All right. Well, I want to jumpstart our discussion by, bringing the audience into what we are discussing here. So maybe it's a non-obvious way of starting the conversation, but it's about the public awareness and education, and how important it is that the public gets also involved in this debate on sustainable transportation. And maybe, Lucas, I'll start with you. If you can bring your own perspectives on how critical you think this would be, have the general public involved in this conversation as, you know, maybe an enabler for us to move faster.
Happy to, and thanks, Daniel, for the question. I think the public awareness is key, because we're essentially talking about something really, really big, you know, sustainable transport in times of climate emergency. Those are big words. So we essentially need a leap in innovation. We need to just not make a step forward, but we need to leap forward. And how do you do this? You, of course, have the technology. You need to have the technology to do that. You need to have a business model, how to make use of this technology and eventually earn money. But most critically, you need to have the support of the society in doing that. And if we stick to aviation or aerospace for a moment and look back at history, we had a similar situation in the 20th century where we saw a leap in innovation in aerospace, which was basically the time between the 1940s and the 1970s, where we as a world went from flying propeller aircraft to having the Boeing 747 jumbo jet cross the Atlantic with Pan Am. 30 years more or less in between. And how did we get there? There was the technology, of course. There was the business model that enabled, you know, having, with that kind of size aircraft, making transatlantic travel mainstream so that people could take the plane, no longer the boat. But the key aspect was the society. And there are two elements to it. One is the external element, and the other one is call it the intrinsic motivation. The external element at that time was a military one. First we had World War II, then we had the Cold War. So it was essential also for the public understanding that we need to advance here as the Western world, because otherwise the Soviets would be the number one, and we would not want to allow this to happen. The intrinsic element was the vision to motivate people to become part of this movement. And this was something where President John F. Kennedy was very good at. He had a speech in the early 60s where he said, "We choose to go to the moon. We want to have a man on the moon by the end of the decade," which was a incredibly candid statement at this time, because, you know, it was just a couple years earlier the Soviets had launched their first satellite into orbit, Sputnik, and suddenly the president of America comes like, let's go to the moon. So, but it still created a movement where people said like, yeah, let's do this. It turned out to be successful. We had somebody on the moon in the late 60s. So going back to the situation we have now, I think this is what we need to look at. We already have the external factor to dominate this conversation. We have climate change. So it is important people already are aware that, yeah, we need to respond to this, otherwise the consequences will be dire. But we also need the intrinsic motivation within the public, that the public say, yes, I want to have sustainable transportation. I want to have zero-emission aircraft. This is cool. Let's build it. Or aside from aviation, let's build a high-speed rail network in the US. Yeah, this is cool. I don't know if you leave the city limits of Austin, go into the countryside, how many people you will still find that go like, yeah, high-speed rail to Dallas, awesome, let's do it. But this is kind of where we need to look into how do we get the public on board, because that's crucial. That's the most important element of getting to sustainable transportation, and everything comes behind that. And we already know how to proceed in terms of the technology, but we need to find the critical mass that we do spend the money on it and go ahead.
Right. Anything you want to add, Rose, to looking at public awareness, education, how it impacts the companies that you support, the technologies you're looking at?
Sure, absolutely. So I think you've done a wonderful job, Lucas, of explaining kind of, you know, why creating buzz about a particular technology is important. I mean, it really does help create a market pull, which is important for everyone in the ecosystem, right? It's also helpful to get people excited about clean energy technologies because we're in a democratic society. We can use our vote to help make sure that there are people who are elected that are excited about clean energy technologies, and that then drives the policy making aspect of the process, which is also crucial. So that's another sort of draw. And then, if people are excited about clean energy technologies, they're much more likely to be tolerant of something new entering their environment. So if it's, a high-speed rail, right? Maybe it causes some disruption for a time while it's being built. People are much more willing to put up with that, right? Because they understand this is getting us where we want to go long term. It's going to be better long term. So that public engagement, that public advocacy is so crucial. I completely agree.
Thank you, Rose. I'll switch now the conversation towards the economic aspects of the challenge we are facing. And I'll start with you, Rose, on how can we combine the imperative to make something happen when it comes to the climate emergency, but also find those economically viable business models that I think Lucas made a brief reference to. That was a big part of the discussion we had in the morning panels today. It was a pretty interesting moment when the question was asked. But I would love to hear your perspectives on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for asking. I agree. It's a really important question, an important issue, because we can't just wish these new technologies into existence, right? We need ultimately to find technologies that are both solving a problem and doing it well, right? They have the technical performance characteristics we're looking for, but they're also commercially viable. They've just got to be. They've got to be able to stand on their own legs. And we think about this process using a term called the green premium. Pardon me. So the green premium is really a metric that we use to kind of help understand where in the development process a technology sort of exists, right? And so as a technology becomes more de-risked and more commercially viable, its green premium goes down. And let me just back up a second. The green premium is the cost of a technology that is environmentally friendly, that is over and above the cost of the incumbent technology, right? So for the aviation sector, sustainable aviation fuel is a good example. It's a low carbon alternative to traditional jet fuel, right? And it has a price differential. So we're working to decrease that. And an important way to do that is to eliminate the green premium, right? We've got to do that. We do that by helping to develop the technology, helping to scale the technology, and then also ensuring that the market is ready for it, that there are the policies and regulations and standards in place in order to ensure that it's going to be successful once it reaches the market. And so it's this big sort of ball of wax, really, right? You've got to have a technology that's amazing in and of itself, that is commercially viable, that is accepted by the public, that has the regulations in place for it. These are tall orders, but nonetheless, very much worth pursuing. And so that's what we're really geared toward doing at Breakthrough Energy, kind of as a whole. And it's wonderful to see, the work that both of you two are doing in order to help this progression as well.
It's quite amazing. I remember joining earlier this year an event in San Francisco when one of the speakers challenged a bit the green premium definition and asked the question, should we be talking about green premium or dirty discount? that was a pretty interesting provocation. And with that, I want to hear your thoughts as well, Lucas.
Yeah, it's a very important point, and I think what you have to realize is that green transport will be economically viable, but it's going to take some time, and somebody has to bridge this gap until it becomes really, truly economically viable. But it is this way with every technology. I think was an example yesterday at dinner when Carl Benz built his first automobile, which was a motorized carriage, and he took that for a ride. He drove from town to town, and his wife was with him. And in every town, she had to get off, go to the local pharmacy, and buy a bottle of petrol to fill into the tank, and then they could make it to the next town. So this is how complicated cars started out to be. And I think this is something to realize, you can't just like pull a switch with the new technology and suddenly, everything is flying on hydrogen, for example.
We'll stop by pharmacies and asking if they have liquid hydrogen.
Exactly, yeah. Maybe they do, but not enough to fill up a whole plane, I would say. But it's something that, has some complex issues around it. How do you build the infrastructure? How do you also keep the momentum over many years? Because it will take years to build them up. We've saw it with EVs. And who's going to pay for it? So those are really complex questions where you have to know that this is going to take time, and you'll need to be aware that you will have to stretch through that period until you get there.
I think you touched at a very, very important point, which is the long-term aspect of what we're talking about, right? It's not something that will get solved in a term of 4 years or until next election. This is really something long-term that we need to embrace as industry and also as society, which is tough, which is really tough to do. We're fortunate we're talking about a democracy, but we know how tough it is to get things going. And that's why I wanted to switch now the conversation to public policy, right? And what's the important roles that the governments also have to play. And if we look back to some of, success cases and history, I'll just make a reference to one program that we're very proud in Brazil, which is our ethanol program. I think in the panel this morning, we heard about a startup that is working on sustainable aviation fuels, but their first business model was to make vodka, right? And then there was the question, are they going to feed vodka to the planes? Well, in Brazil, we can say we feed cachaça to the aircraft. Embraer certified the very first 100% sustainable aviation fuel aircraft globally, which is the Ipanema, is a crop duster that runs on full ethanol. And for those of you who don't know, the Brazilian distillate called cachaça is almost 100% ethanol. So if we feed it to the plane, maybe it will work. But anyhow, the example of the ethanol program in Brazil was a very interesting one. It took place in the 70s during the major oil crisis when oil prices really went up high. Brazil lacked a local domestic production back then. So the government created this incentive program to try and solve the supply and demand inequation. And it ended up fostering the birth of an entire new sugarcane and ethanol production industry that really went large scale. And many people don't realize today Brazil may be the country that needs the least of EVs because 100% of our fleet can run on ethanol, which is fully renewable fuel. But if it was not for that government policy back in the 70s, we would be certainly nowhere close, right? So I just bring this example to start the discussion on what do you, both of you, see as the roles that government need to play in this challenge that we're facing as well.
So I'll start. I think the role is crucial, and we have to, if we want sustainable transportation, we need to be aware of that it's going to be expensive, and somebody will have to pay for it. And we already discussed from the beginning there will not be a viable market, so the market is not going to pay for it, and that basically brings us down to the government / the taxpayer. So they have to be the incentive to kickstart the development where a market can come from. And I think a good example right now is the business of SAF, Sustainable Aviation Fuels. We see that we have the quotas, we see that we have so many airlines in the world signing off-take agreements, doing PR about this, but we still don't see this translate into actual projects where refineries for SAF are being built at large scale. Why is that the case? Because the oil and gas industry makes a much better margin working on the fossil side with a lot less risk. So they're not going to invest until they are forced to. And this is something where politics will have to come up with how do you incentivize things? How do you spark the development? There is the carrot approach with the Inflation Reduction Act here in the US. There is the stick approach within Europe where we have the mandates that will come into play. But this is something where I think we will need to work together on how to look for the best practices internationally and what we can learn from them. And I think a good example was mentioned here this morning about the EV initiative of Norway, which was heavily incentivized with terrific success. And I think those are the examples to look into and see how can we translate this into aviation and making sustainable aviation or sustainable transportation in general a reality.
Yeah, no, you brought a good point on how different countries, different regions are dealing with the issue, right? Maybe Rose, I don't know, from the perspective of breakthrough industry energies, how do you see this impacting the roadmap, right?
Yes, absolutely. Policy is so important. Pardon me. So in the US in particular, our US policy and advocacy team has been very involved in advocating for smart policies, right? It's not an accident that good legislation is just sort of written, right? It really takes a group of stakeholders to come together and make sure that all of the diverse voices are heard and incorporated, their concerns and needs are incorporated into these policies. And so advocacy is a huge, important part of what we were just talking about here. It's also very important to help, put policy in place that will drive innovation, right? So for example, in the US, we've had some legislation come through, the bipartisan infrastructure law, that set up the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations in the Department of Energy, which has been really helpful in being able to help finance some of those first-of-a-kind demonstration projects. So that's a huge win for the industry in general, or for the space in general, let's say. And then there's also the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, which its name kind of belies the fact that it really has helped fund a lot of clean energy technologies, which is just fantastic. And it has funded programs that have trickled down throughout the government. So Department of Energy, I'm very familiar with, and they have put out lots of funding opportunity announcements, big dollar values to help generate technology development at all stages, really, earliest stage through deployment. And that's just been really catalytic in the US. So it's a great example of policy informing reality and sort of helping to create this clean energy world. It also provides, so in addition to sort of providing funding, it also gives some stability and some comfort maybe to investors that, this is a sector worth investing in. It's going to be around for a while, right? Our investments will carry through and we'll have some legs to them. That's an important market signal to get from the policy angle. And then it also helps to de-risk adoption, right? So we were talking about the green premium. Tax incentives from the Inflation Reduction Act certainly help eat down some of that green premium for technologies as they're continuing their development trajectory. Ideally, they get to a place where they don't need those incentives in order to be commercially viable compared to the incumbent technologies. But, who are we kidding? It's a long road, and we need help along the way. And so it's policy is just so important.
It goes a long way, right? And the impact to investment decisions is very concrete, right? Very direct. I just wanted to elude, since you mentioned Department of Energy, right? The initiative around ARPA-E.
Yes,
ARPA
yes.
Energy, I thought was such a smart move, because going back to what Lucas mentioned before during Cold War, and I mean, agencies like DARPA,
Yes.
I mean, you cannot understand the economic impact of all the research that they funded and the new technologies that became mature enough to hit the civilian market and dramatically impact the way we live today, right? Everything from satellites to the smartphone, so many spillovers out of those big tech pushes that agencies like DARPA was capable. I think Europe looked at that model, right, and also inspired some of the European programs. So now seeing the work that ARPA-E is doing, I'm optimistic. There is some, I mean, interesting developments, but I mean, we need to move faster. We need to keep moving. And with that, I want to now come to maybe what the audience has been waiting, which is edge technologies. It's high tech, right? It's the answer to some of those difficult challenges, very complex challenges. Of course, it will go through new technologies, right? And how can we make sure they will become available sooner rather than later and mature? And I want to start with you, Rose, on what is the interesting or something that is catching our attention in what you're looking at when we think about eco-friendly transportation. What are the emerging technologies that you think may play a role? I know you don't have the crystal ball, but I know both of you look into very state-of-the-art companies and tech, so I would be delighted to hear and share with the audience what has been, you know, in your focus.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I could talk about this for hours. This is really my jam, but
I won't let you. I'm looking.
Okay. It's good. This is good. So it's funny you mentioned ARPA-E because prior to my, working at Breakthrough Energy, I worked for Booz Allen Hamilton, and I was a technical consultant at ARPA-E, really embedded in their operations. So I have so much love for ARPA-E. It is a fantastic organization. Advanced Research Projects Agency Energy, for those who aren't familiar with the acronym.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Absolutely, absolutely. And, at ARPA-E, that's where I sort of cut my teeth, let's say, on the aviation space. So I remember sitting down with the program directors, David Tu, Michael O'Hady, Peter DeBach, and, looking at a whole aircraft, right? So we know that aviation is a challenging space to decarbonize, especially when you're talking about long-haul commercial aviation. It's just, it's a big plane. There are so many megawatts of megawatt hours of energy that are on a plane, in the form of fuel in order to get you from point A to point B. Trying to swap that out for something else is hard, really hard. Batteries at this point are not capable of, supporting a commercial aircraft for a long-haul flight.
The factor is about 1,000, right? Maybe it's interesting for the audience to hear. The amount of energy you can pack in a kilogram of jet fuel is still 1,000 more order of magnitude than a battery.
Yes.
So that's why we're looking into batteries for short flights, very smaller aircraft, but it's a huge, huge challenge.
Yes, yes. So, taking all that on board, right? We all sat down and looked at, an aircraft. We picked, and forgive me, Embraer, we picked a Boeing as just an aircraft.
You're forgiven.
To do the analysis.
It's an industry challenge, the one we have.
Indeed. And so we kind of thought about okay, how would you reimagine this aircraft in order to, have net zero flight for long haul transportation? What technologies need to be developed? What's missing in order to make this a reality? And out of that analysis came a couple programs. One of them was called REACH, REEACH, and that is focused on fuel to electric power conversion technologies. So my sort of core expertise is fuel cells, so electrochemistry meets material science. One way to accomplish that challenge, of fuel to electric power conversion at high efficiency is to combine a high temperature fuel cell with a turbine. And you can sort of take advantage of synergies in the operation, the optimal operating parameters for both pieces of equipment in order to achieve 70-ish% efficiency, which is pretty great when you're talking about that kind of conversion. It's better than you could do with either a turbine or a fuel cell alone. So that is a really interesting, future-looking technology that was funded out of ARPA-E. That program had a number of different, ways of funded a number of different technologies that were trying to address that challenge. And I believe that program's still going. It's in phase 2, so hopefully we'll see some of those technologies out in the world. Another one is kind of the sister program to that, which is focused on, okay, you've created your electricity, now you need an electric motor that's going to be energy dense enough, like light enough and efficient enough in order to sort of buy its way onto the aircraft, So it's really thinking about reinventing the whole, fuel to power conversion system and how you would operate an aircraft in that way. And it was a really interesting experience to go through that exercise because, we quickly realized as we were, interacting with folks in the aviation sector, like a lot of that is really siloed. And so sitting down and getting everyone together and saying, look, this is a big challenge. Let's all put our heads together and figure out how to make this work in practice and what technologies we need ended up being a really motivating experience for a lot of people. Really helped to sort of break down some boundaries and think more broadly. So that was, those were a couple programs that I was fortunate enough to be able to help support. Interesting technologies came out of it. Now with my breakthrough energy hat on, right? Some of the technologies that we're funding right now, I'm just really excited about. So for example, when you think about, say, using hydrogen for a fuel, right? We're talking about it's hard to store, the tanks are heavy, which is, competes with your payload, right? And in order to make it an economically viable situation, you've got to transport cargo too, not just tanks of fuel. So what do? Well, we funded in the Fellows Program a team called Vern, a company called Vern. They have developed relatively lightweight tanks for cryocompressed hydrogen. And what they're able to do is store hydrogen, store more usable hydrogen than you would get if you were using liquefied hydrogen. And the cost of the fuel, it ends up being much less because you don't have to take it all the way to the liquid state. It's compressed, but not that much. And so it ends up being, sort of really economically attractive overall. And they've gotten some great, they've signed a partnership sort of memorandum of understanding with Zero Avia, which is a company that Breakthrough Energy Ventures funds for its hydrogen electric powertrain development for aircraft.
Well, right?
Exactly, fuel cell. So they're working together to figure out, that question of, right, like how do we make this work for an aircraft? How can we partner? So that's neat to see in the ecosystem, some of these technologies sort of coming to life. We're also in the Fellows Program, thinking about critical minerals that are involved in battery technologies. So lithium, for example, lithium extraction is, it's a really important issue, both economically and from a supply chain, continuity, sort of security perspective. It's really important to be able to do that close to home. And so we have some technologies, 2 of them, that we're funding right now. One of them is called electroflow technologies, and they are using an electrochemical cell in order to selectively separate lithium from a brine So you might desalinate some water, and then the brine you've got left over, you can then use that to extract lithium. There are some natural brines that also exist that are lithium rich, so you can use those as well. But it's really interesting. It kind of utilizes battery technology effectively in order to do that extraction. And then we have a team called Olokun Minerals who are working on a technology to separate lithium, but also some other elements of interest from brines using a chromatography process. So, it would be really interesting to be able to separate and utilize multiple different things at once. It's, these are early stage technologies, but we do think that if we help them mature, help them with some funding and some mentorship, that they could potentially play a role in the future. So
that was very impressive.
Thank you.
It's
Thank
a
you.
very vast array.
I could keep
this
going,
is
but
just
I
a
will
teaser,
stop.
right?
Yes, I better.
But I want to give
Yes.
Lucas a chance. Just before I pass the ball to you, Lucas, I want to give a hint to the audience. We're going to open up for questions from the audience if you are interested to address our panelists. So there's a microphone right over there. If anyone wants to ask a question, I just kindly ask you to come to the microphone so that people who are listening to the broadcast can hear the question as well. But Lucas, please, feel free to share with us some of the interesting tech that you have been seeing at Sustainable Labs.
Yes, so thanks, Rose. I think you already gave some fantastic examples here. So maybe I'll assess a little bit more from the meta layer again. When looking at transportation, there are some segments which have pretty much already found their way forward. Cars, for example, it's becoming clear that electrification, electric cars, electric vehicles will be the way to go for decarbonization. And segments like aviation are much more difficult because they're much more complex and they have so many different use cases. So you need to differentiate which use case are you looking at, and you also need to deal with that there's probably not going to be one way, but many different solutions in parallel for the long term. And especially if you go for long-haul travel, in the next 30 years, probably sustainable aviation fuels will be a very, very important aspect. So that's looking at SAF. Then there is hydrogen, which has tremendous potential, but that potential to really unlock and unleash will take a little longer. So you're probably speaking about the second half of the century. But to get there by 2050, you need to start now, and because this is early stage now, so you need to work on this to have an industrialized product by 2050, which is why you need to work on this in parallel. And electrification, for example, is something for the regional level, where also this could be implemented in the cabin, for example, using additional resources where you don't need the fuel any longer. And another aspect which we're also touching with the Sustainable Air Lab is the software side, the digital side, which is still a huge aspect of our industry, which is oftentimes overlooked, I'd say. And I don't know if you remember the story from Southwest Airlines last year or the year before during Christmas, where basically the whole schedule collapsed and crews had to manually call in the operations center and tell, yes, we're here in Des Moines, Iowa. We're like 7 crew members and 1 737. That's archaic. Yeah, this is how it was done in the 1970s. This is how it's still done today. So there's a lot of efficiency gains still to be made by using software that can only use AI, for example, to make slot mechanisms more efficient.
And deliver results in the short term, right?
Exactly, and a lot of emissions are being caused and burned at airports such as London Heathrow, where every morning aircraft are circling for hours waiting for their slot to land. So aside from looking at new propulsion technologies that are more efficient, this is also something we need to tackle, that we say it's terribly inefficient and bad for the environment if you have somebody, a flight from Austin, Texas, circle over London for 35 minutes. before you can eventually land. That's 35 minutes of generating CO2 emissions, which you don't need.
That goes to waste, right?
Yes.
Yeah. I remember another discussion, again from the panels this morning, on fleet renewal as well, right? It's something
Exactly.
that there are many aircraft flying with 30 plus years, and the current generation of aircraft, which is already available, can already abate like 20%, 25%, depending
Yes.
on type.
And this is also a very interesting topic as a final point. We want to be a net zero industry in aviation by 2050. The average lifespan of an aircraft, of a commercial airliner today, is around 25 years. So the planes that are being delivered today will still be flying in 2050. I came in the first aircraft I boarded coming here to Austin was an aircraft which was delivered 27 years ago. It's still flying today, 7 flights a day. So we need also to look at not only which are the zero emission propulsion technologies that could power aircraft by 2040, but also what am I going to do with the 5,000 Boeing 737s and the 6,000 A320s that will still be around by then? And how can I improve them in terms of emissions, because we'll still have to deal with them.
We have an answer to that. We would like to see many more E2s flying here in North America and elsewhere. But I'll leave that for later. Let's now hear questions from our audience. Please, thank you for...
Hi, this is Sarah. I'm a commercialization consultant. My questions are for Breakthrough Energy. You're recently newly formed organization. What is the makeup of the partners for your deployment branch? And the other question is, I provide SBIR TAVA services, and I just happen to know of a 3D printed blower that was optimized for a solid oxide fuel cells, and they didn't re-up for SBIR funds. So is that the type of company that you'd be interested in helping advance?
These are good questions. Okay, so let me take your first one. The network of partners in the deployment space, so our Catalyst program, is very diverse. There are a lot of players from industry in particular who are represented there, and that really speaks to kind of the market pull for those technologies. So it's, there's also some venture funds that are part of that as well. And we also, want to make sure that there are, sort of governments that are also aligned with that work. So it's a broad network of partners, to be perfectly honest, but there's a real focus on industry. Now, in terms of the SBIR question, that's a tricky one to answer without getting into more details on the technology. But certainly things that are really innovative, really a step out in technology development, that's all very much of interest to us.
All in your radar.
Exactly, yeah.
That's good. I think we'll have time for some closing thoughts and some final takeaways you would like to leave the audience with, maybe starting with you, Lucas, on everything we discussed today and the huge challenge we have ahead of us.
Yeah. So I think the discussion also in that framing is a very important one to have, and I think it's important to realize that this is not an industry discussion that we have to face as the aviation industry, or that somebody like Embraer has to focus on, but it's a discussion that we need to have as a society, and that we need to embrace that we need this transformation. And we have been, when it comes to the climate emergency, we have been lucky as the aviation industry that we have not had a black swan event yet, like COVID. Because I can remember before 2020, the thought of that you would not be able to get onto an aircraft and fly from London to New York or anywhere else was outlandish. You would say that, yeah, that's not going to happen. either way. Even during World War II, you could get a ship from Europe to the US still. So there had always been ways around. Until there weren't. In 2020, everything came to a full stop. And I still remember well the insecurity that everybody faced. What's going to happen? How are things going to continue? And we were lucky as the world society that after 1 year, 1.5 years, there was a vaccine available that could bring us back to normal. And we're not going to have that kind of trump card when it comes to climate change. So all we can do is really make up our minds, what are our strategies in combating this slow change, and just hope that we don't run into such a black swan event, not only for aviation, but for the world in general. But we need to be aware that we must respond to this. This will be the defining challenge of this century for us. The 20th century was a military challenge, and this will be an environmental challenge. But this will be the defining challenge of the century. And it's like in the 20th century, it's going to hit us in the middle of the century, and we already need to look into how are we going to respond to this.
That's a very nice way to frame it. There's no one-year vaccine that will solve this issue, right? It's a lot of hard work and, again, long-term planning and thinking and consistency in execution. So what are your thoughts, Rose, for us to close?
Well, I'll certainly echo what Lucas said. This is a challenge. It's hard. It's really, really hard. But I think that there are exciting aspects of what we're seeing, right? There's some really, bright, shining lights, and in terms of technology development, there are some really exciting developments in terms of market traction for some of the clean energy technologies we've been discussing. And I think I'm ultimately optimistic that we will, at least make a very big impact on climate change. But the importance of partnerships and networks just cannot be understated. We've all got to work together.
Yeah, and to connect to this, I also think it's important that we are optimistic about this, because humans have mastered big challenges before. So, we can be optimistic, but we need to work on it. And I also think there will be a whole new segments and businesses to unwind. So this will be exciting for us. And maybe we'll look back into the fossil age someday as we look back into the tobacco age. So like 40, 50 years ago, we would have been sitting here with cigarettes, on the panel, and we would look back and how could, people sit on stage with a cigarette, and people will be in the same way, like how could, everybody drive this fossil-fueled car in the city and all the exhaust, and, how was that acceptable even? That's nuts. Yeah, and I think hopefully this would be the ideal outcome, that, back in 2070 or so, our children, our grandchildren will look back at it and just have a laugh and say, like, God, what a time that was.
I love that we can close on a high note, given the complexity of the challenge we have ahead of us. There's a saying that I love. I use it to work before in the oil and gas industry, right? It's my dark side of the force story. And, we believe that the same way that the rock age was not over because of lacks of rocks, it's not like the oil age will be over because of lack of oil. It's because we'll come up with some ingenious series of solutions, and through a lot of collaboration and partnership, I'm also optimistic we'll find a way. Yep. But we'll need help, and I will close by inviting all of our audience, companies, government, startups, investors from every sector. This is a huge challenge, but also a huge opportunity. And I'm sure Sustainable Air Labs, Breakthrough Energies, Embraer X, we are very much keen to discuss with you, to hear your thoughts, hear your ideas, and collaborate so that we can find that roadmap and make it work together. So I will close with that thought, And thank you very much for being together with us here at South by Southwest. And enjoy the rest of the show. Thank you so much.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you both. Rose,
Thank you.
Lucas.
Thank you.
Thank you.